Now, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered the field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, and he greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseers of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained here from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I have been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you have left your father and your mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Amen.
Well done, Helen. Elimelech. We'll keep practicing. That was very good. Father, thank you for your word. And as we meditate on it now, we would ask that we will hear you speak to us through it. I thank you, you do speak. Lord, help us to listen, we pray. Amen. Our story today is a very old story, but it's also a very modern story. It highlights three interconnected issues. First of all, there's the issue of poverty. And it says this in verse 2. "And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, 'Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor.'" She is scraping around for a living. There are very few options open to Ruth. Commentator Marian Ann Taylor observes, "As a destitute and childless Moabite woman, Ruth had few honorable options open to her for employment. She chooses the hot, back-breaking, dawn-to-dust job of gathering up grain left behind those working the fields. I'm interested by that word honourable. She had few honourable options because there were less honourable options that were open to her and open to women across our world today. A report recently issued by Beyond the Streets and a joint public issues team, of which Baptists Together are one of the 4 constituent denominations, looked into the impact of COVID-19 on women who sell sex or are sexually exploited. The report says this: exploitation of women who sell sex is often driven by poverty. Offering women real choices means ensuring there are realistic alternative ways of avoiding poverty for themselves and their children without selling sex. The report goes on to recommend that benefits should be made accessible for no recourse for public funds groups, and a 5-week waiting time for universal credit should be reduced, as it, and I quote, drives many women who qualify but are waiting for support into debt, poverty, and sexually exploitative situations. Ruth, along with many women across our world today, is vulnerable because of her poverty. Secondly, we have the issue here of foreigners. One definition of a foreigner is a person not belonging to a particular place or group. When Boaz arrives and sees this young woman gleaning in his field, he asks his overseer, his manager, who does that young woman belong to? Interesting phrase, isn't it? Who does she belong to? That's because in those days, women belonged to a man, whether it was her father, her husband, or the wider family. To which the manager responds, she is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. In other words, she's a foreigner. That's her identity. That's the first thing he says to describe her. She's a foreigner. She's not one of us. Sadly, we sometimes don't get beyond the person's nationality. There is Somalian, an Indian, a Pakistani, a Pole, a Romanian, without seeing the person beyond their nationality. We are a country that currently welcomes foreigners if they have enough money and or expertise and skills. But if they are poor or unskilled, they are not welcome to live here. And even if they are fleeing persecution or are displaced because of wars or natural disasters, some find themselves on the receiving end of what the government, they used to call it the hostile environment policies. They don't call it that anymore. They call it the compliant environment policies. But the basic idea is you make life pretty tough for these people. We don't process their applications with any speed. 80% have to wait longer than the government's own target of 6 months for their first application to be processed. Of those who refused asylum and appeal, the courts deemed that the government was wrong in half of the cases. We have recently held asylum seekers in former army camps until the government's own inspectors deemed them unsafe, unclean, and unfit. And now we're talking about putting camps in Central Africa. According to the Joint Public Issues team as well, the Home Office is now pursuing policies, and I quote, which effectively punish asylum seekers who arrive via irregular routes. And the rhetoric from government now is this word irregular, actually using the word illegal. I'm hearing it over and over again. Illegal asylum seekers. What is an illegal asylum seeker? These are some of the most desperate people on our planet. And immediately they're going to be punished because they haven't come through the legal routes. You just wonder how some of these people are meant to get here and get help anyway. We're not always great at welcoming foreigners, particularly those in greatest need. And there's something we can learn from the ancient laws of Israel here. God commanded that they must make provision for the poor and the foreigner. So this is what it says in Deuteronomy 24. It says, when you're harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. And when you beat the olives from your trees, don't go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. And when you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, don't go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. This practice of gleaning, allowing people to glean for themselves, a survival way of living, is very different, I think, from modern Western aims of maximizing profits and the drive for efficiency that raw capitalism demands. There are schemes, though, I think schemes that probably follow this gleaning principle. I think the food bank is probably a scheme like that, isn't it? Where we perhaps buy a bit extra and leave a bit for those who are in particular need. I think Free Cycle has done something similar. I think the charity shops work on that sort of gleaning idea as well, where expensive goods become affordable to those who couldn't buy them otherwise. I think we need to allow slack in our system for gleaning to take place, to allow those on the margins to freely benefit from the abundance that we enjoy. The Israelites also understood that the land didn't belong to them. They understood that the land was God's and they were stewards of the land. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, wrote the psalmist. And so when we think about our goods, when we think about our cars, when we think about our homes, we can't think of them as our possessions simply to do as we please for our enjoyment. Actually, we are responsible before God to use those things wisely, which includes using them for those who have the least. So we have the issue of poverty, and we have the issue of foreigners. These are two of the issues that Ruth faced. But also, the third interconnected issue is the issue of gender-based violence. I don't know if you picked this up on the story. Verse 9a, it says this: "Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I've told the men not to lay a hand on you." One translation actually spells it out. I've told the men not to molest you. They make it very clear what this is about. The men who greet Boaz in verse 4 with the words, "The Lord bless you," are presumably the same men who pose a threat of laying their hands on Ruth. These are the ones who say the right things, but their actions are far from right. The global statistics about gender-based violence are shocking. Elaine Storkey, who I think she headed up Tear Fund, she was certainly very involved with Tear Fund. She wrote this book a few years ago, Scars Across Humanity. It's certainly worth a read. It was written 6 years ago. She says this: "Acts of violence to women aged between 15 and 44 across the globe produce more deaths, disability, and mutilation than cancer, malaria, and traffic accidents combined." The story of Ruth is a very old story, but sadly, it's a very modern story as well. Across the world, women encounter gender-based violence with startling regularity in the form of rape, physical and psychological harassment, child marriage, female genital mutilation, the trafficking of women and girls in modern-day slavery, war-related rape, unwanted physical or sexual touching. In March, the BBC reported that in the UK, 10% of women aged 16 to 24 have been a victim of sexual assault in the last year. 1 in 10 of our 16 to 24-year-olds in our country have been a victim of sexual assault in the last year. 1 in 40 young women have been raped in this country in the last year. A survey of UK women revealed that 4 out of 10 women had been groped or faced unwelcome touching at some point. A third of women had been followed. 1 in 5 had faced indecent exposure. Half had been victims of sexual harassment at work. And we've been hearing news of the serious problems there are in our secondary schools and the problems that girls face. 9 years ago, an article in The Independent said rape and sexual violence against women are endemic everywhere. Those punches, slaps, kicks, and bile-filled screams are happening all around us. Yes, undoubtedly on our own streets. A quarter of women will face this abuse at some point in their life. And horrifyingly, 2 women will be murdered by their current or former male partner each week. It's not just the overt aggression, it's a sexual harassment and objectification of women by men that provide fertile ground for this violence. Some men may regard a few jokes about rape as a bit of harmless banter, but it all helps to normalize violence against women. As a country, the article says, we still don't take rape survivors seriously. And we're 9 years on, and the same issues are surfacing again, and the same questions, and are we any further on? Ruth is an old story, but it is a very modern story. And so Ruth faces these 3 interconnected issues of poverty, of being a foreigner, and of gender-based violence. And as one commentator summarizes, Ruth is a vulnerable, destitute foreigner at risk of physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. Now, the story tells us that God remembers Ruth. He has seen her loyalty to Naomi. He has seen her loyalty to Naomi's nation, to Israel. He's seen her loyalty to himself, to Naomi's God. And it says in a very understated way in verse 3, as it turned out. In other words, these things just fell into place. But it's talking here about providence. God knew Ruth and was looking after her. It says, as it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz. God's protection and his kesef for Ruth is going to be experienced through this man, Boaz. It's important to note, I think, that this is more than just a love story. This isn't Mr. Darcy riding on his horse to come and rescue Elizabeth Bennet and woo her off her feet. But this is about a man in a position of power and influence, using his position and power in a way that is right before God, showing kesef, loving kindness, which reflects God's very own kesef. We see in verses 8 and 9 Boaz's generosity and protection towards Ruth. Let me read these out. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I've told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you're thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. That last little bit is really interesting, because as a foreigner, she would be expected to get drinks and water for the Israelites. And as a woman, she would be expected to get drinks for the men. But actually, his kindness is that she will be looked after by them. And then in verse 14 and 16, let me read these verses. It says, at mealtime, Boaz said to her, come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar. And when she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As soon as she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, let her gather some among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her. He's looking after her. It's a picture of grace. It's not just getting what is expected or what's deserved. This is about abundant provision, going beyond what is normal, what is deserved, what is expected. This is kesef at work. Boaz uses his power and position to provide and protect for a vulnerable person and for her family. He lives out this life of kesef. Well, let me just say 3 things in conclusion. And they're all under this. I believe God invites us to imitate Boaz. First of all, by speaking out for those whose voice is not heard. Writer Elizabeth Gerhardt invites the church to embrace God's call to care for women who are abused. She writes, the time for ministering to abused women and girls is now. The time to work for structural change that will improve the lives of women and girls is now. The time to speak on behalf of those who cannot speak for themselves because of oppressive systems that deny their human dignity is now. Jesus demands, come, follow me. And as members of Christ's church, we have both the calling and the ability to help those who are vulnerable or oppressed, as well as to influence the world to prevent future exploitation from occurring. We can challenge the social, economic, political, and cultural conditions that force women to sell and endanger themselves for survival. We can help the Ruths and Naomis of today get safely across their deserts and find hope on the other side. As Gerhard says, the time is now. Similarly, we might be in a position where we can speak out for asylum seekers, or we might be in a position where we can speak out for those who are trapped in poverty, both in our country and across the world. We're called to be Boazes by speaking out for those whose voice is not heard. Secondly, we're called to imitate Boaz in avoiding behavior that exacerbates the problem. Human trafficking would not be a problem if men did not consume pornography. Life would be easier for those struggling with poverty if we didn't demand lower and lower prices, and if we were willing to insist on goods we purchase being fairly traded. The government wouldn't feel the need to set such draconian conditions for irregular asylum seekers if they knew the majority of people were happy to warmly welcome them, regardless as to how they have arrived here. We avoid actions that exacerbate the problem. And then thirdly and finally, I think we imitate Boaz when the opportunity arises. And by this I mean simply doing day-to-day acts of kindnesses, making a donation to the food bank, supporting Syrian families who've settled here in Bicester, watching out for those who are at risk who come our way because of their circumstances or lack of resources, or because they are foreigners in an unfamiliar place. Some of this can be achieved through some of the brilliant charities we have. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. But might simply be that people come our way where actually we can be a Boaz at that moment. We can help them because they've come to our attention. We do acts of kindness. Galatians 6 verse 9 says, "Do not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Don't become weary in doing good. If you've been doing this, keep going. Don't become weary. Keep doing it. Keep doing good acts of kindness. Keep doing good deeds to people. This is what God calls us to do. Acts of Kesef. We live a life of Kesef because we are God's children and we are recipients of his Kesef. We use our position and privilege to help those who don't have position and privilege. We do to others as we would have them do to us. And there are times when we can be Boazes to other people who are in Ruth's position, but who knows, we might be Ruths at some point in our life. And maybe we have been and maybe we are now, where we are desperately in need of someone, a Boaz, to come and speak and act and help us. May God help us to live a life of Kesef, loving kindness, as we see enacted by Boaz in Ruth chapter 2.